Do you know who I am? The question landed in the penthouse dining room like a slammed door on a quiet night, sharp and strangely small all at once. The chandelier threw shards of light across polished marble. The tablecloth was so white it looked like paper. The smell of truffle and lemon floated under the hum of expensive laughter. He smelled of bleach and coffee and the kind of tired that lives in calloused hands. She wore a blue dress that fit like authority and did not smile. In a corner, a phone screen glowed red with the familiar dot of recording, a tiny accusation that made the room rearrange itself into an audience. Outside, the city buzzed and forgot about the people at that table by the time dessert arrived. At home, his daughter drew with stubborn concentration, pressing crayons so hard the paper groaned. For her, this man was a magic machine that could fix scraped knees and find missing socks. A single, unexpected sentence in that room would unmake the prank planned by men in suits and become the first thread of something larger than embarrassment, a sequence that would pull at an entire company and at a small girl who had chosen silence as her shield. The night would not end where it began. The man was Marcus Reyes. He had been hired as a daytime custodian at a high-rise on Park Avenue 3 years earlier after a layoff from a warehouse that had eaten his younger years. At 36, he moved with a steady economy of motion, born of long shifts and cheaper dinners. His hands kept the memory of old tools, as if tools could teach patience. In the evenings, he took the subway home with his daughter Lily nested against his shoulder, her hair smelling faintly of shampoo and the blueberry jam she liked to sneak. Lily had stopped speaking in public after a year of unstable housing and a neighbor who shouted too much on dark streets. With her mother gone and foster visits messy and short, she had folded herself into silence like a delicate paper crane. At home, she hummed, arranged stuffed animals in long train lines, and traced imaginary maps on the backs of his hands. Marcus had watched therapists and programs and taken small loans from friends named Javier and Claire to pay for food and a worn-out couch. He had a routine that read like a small liturgy, rising and falling with mop buckets and overtime slips. He could fix a jammed elevator lock with a screwdriver, soothe a preschool meltdown with a banana and a story, and say sorry without needing to explain why. Yet, when the invitation arrived to attend what he thought was a blind date at a private dinner, it was not love that waited in that penthouse, but a joke recorded for an after-party where men traded humiliation the way others traded baseball cards. The prankers were Marcus Reyes. Daniel Park and Victor Hale, two executives who enjoyed the low flicker of other people's discomfort as if it warmed them. They had invited him to be ornate fodder for laughter and a filmed spectacle that would prove nothing and amuse a small group. Their plan was simple and cruel and assumed that Marcus would play his assigned part. Olivia Mercer was the CEO. She had a reputation like a polished coin, cold to the touch and impossible to ignore. Olivia moved through the city in a helicopter and in meetings and on podiums. She wore confidence like armor and had a tendency to fix wrongs with donations and press releases. People liked to place her on two sides of a coin, visionary and ruthless. She had been raised in a house of books and soft discipline and had learned early that language could be a tool for building empires. In her childhood, she had sat under a dining room table and listened to arguments about money and names and survival. Her ascent to the corner office had been paved with sharp decisions and a capacity to say yes when others muttered no. In public, she spoke of strategy and growth and impact. In private, she kept a photograph of a brother who had learned to speak late and had found his voice only when someone refused to ignore him. On the night of the prank, she was present because she had been asked to attend a board celebration and because she enjoyed watching power folding into small spectacles. She did not plan to become what she would become that night. The dinner started like a scene rehearsed too often. Laughter low and precise. Waiters moving like practiced illusions. A man in a suit pretending to be casual. Marcus sat as one sits when you are told to sit in a place not made for you. He checked the edges of his napkin as if it might reveal instructions. The first exchange was sharp. "Do you know who I am?" Olivia asked, without looking up from a menu, as if the question were merely rhetorical. Marcus blinked. "No, ma'am, I'm Marcus Reyes." A small ripple of amusement moved through the table. Daniel Park sipped his wine and smiled at Victor. "He knows his place," Victor said with a voice like linen. Marcus heard it as if it were a small cut. "I'm just here for dinner," he said. "Of course you are," Sandra Lee from HR said with a polished tone that tried to be kind and landed flat. "We wanted to do something different. You must have a story." Lily sipped a juice box at home, unaware of the way the predicate of their lives would shift. She had brought a sugar packet that she liked to tear apart and scatter over her drawings like tiny flags. "Tell us about your daughter," Olivia said. Her tone sharpened in a way Marcus did not expect. "What does she like?" "She likes trains and crayons," Marcus said. "She likes when the moon appears in her window." "How very poetic," Daniel laughed. "A custodial romance story, then." A phone in the corner blinked. The recording light made a thin red mouth. "You have an idyllic life," Victor said loudly. "I pay people to maintain my life, so I don't see it up close." Marcus felt the room lean. His chest tightened. He thought of the slow breath exercises his neighbor Claire had taught him when Lily was awake at night shaking. He felt an old shame, a memory of a school principal who had asked why his shoes were cracked, and a teacher who had said, "Keep him quiet." He shifted in his chair and tried to smile. "Why would this be funny?" Marcus asked with more force than he intended. "Because it will be," Daniel said simply. "Because we are allowed to punch up and laugh. Don't take it personally." Olivia watched him. The glint in her eye was not amusement only, at first. Something else moved behind it, a memory perhaps, a younger brother at a dinner who had been quiet until someone asked the wrong question. Then Olivia said something that halted the room's slow circulation. "My brother learned to speak when someone asked him a silly question and then listened," she said, looking directly at Marcus. "So tell me which train your daughter likes." Her voice was not a joke. It was a small bridge. Marcus, who had not intended to be the center of the room's attention, felt the weight of cameras and ego, and then a hand offered not to humiliate, but to steady. He answered in a small voice. "She likes the green train, because it reminds her of the park." There was a silence that had measurable weight. A fork clanked. The red recording dot seemed suddenly vulgar. In that silence, Lily at home held a sugar packet between her fingers and tore it into a perfect little flag. The sound of the tear was like a match struck. Marcus imagined it as if he could hear it across the city. The night did not end at the table. Someone uploaded a clip to a private chat to be shared and to be laughed at, and the clip leaked. The joke that was not supposed to have a fallout began to spread as rumors and then as outrage. Social media divided into camps. Some condemned the prank as cruel. Some joked about entitled executives who forgot they were being watched. Marcus found himself overnight the subject of commentary as the internet decided which side of the table it wanted to stand on. The company saw the flames and began an awkward cleanup. There would be meetings and memos, but the important thing was different. The small human thing that had occurred in the corner of a dining room and set both families on a collision course toward accountability. Back at home, Lily lined up her stuffed animals in order. Marcus washed dishes and felt the judgment of cameras like a slow heat. He had never asked for any of this attention. He had a job to do and a daughter to keep safe. But now a company's reputation and a man's childhood and a girl's silence were folded together. He called Dr. Aisha Patel, the child therapist recommended by Claire. He wanted Lily to have someone to talk to, even if talking for now meant humming and drawing. Dr. Aisha answered with a voice like soft authority and said, "We will try play-based strategies first." She explained that selective mutism often responded to small rituals and that patience was the main tool. Marcus booked a session and brought Lily a small green train toy with a barcode he had bought with extra overtime. The backstories of the two adults had more in common than first appeared. Marcus had learned to be careful because he had seen chaos bring down houses. He had lost a father to silence in his household, a man who never learned to say sorry. He remembered the smell of his grandmother's kitchen, which had been coffee and cinnamon and a resilience sewn into recipes. Olivia had learned strategy from a mother who measured kindness like a spreadsheet. But there had been a boy, one summer, who taught her that words can be coaxed out with patience. Those private memories would create public consequences. At the 33% mark of this story, a small victory arrived, and it was time to ask to the audience for voices. If you are wiping your eyes now, you are not alone. Stories like this move people because they show the human cost beneath headlines. Share in the comments a moment when a small act of kindness changed someone's path. Start your comment with the word kindness so others can find it. Your memories will create a map of quiet courage and may appear in future episodes where we follow up on small gestures that create big changes. We read every story, and sometimes those stories change how we report and who we reach out to. Now continue with the narrative because the hardest moments were yet to come. After the leak, the company initiated an internal inquiry. The board assigned Sandra Lee from HR and a legal counsel named Harold Green to gather statements. Daniel and Victor offered a public apology that sounded like rehearsed lines about poor judgment. Security footage obtained from the building lobby revealed the clip being shot covertly, and a series of texts showed the plan had been in the works for weeks. For Marcus, the legalese felt abstract. For Lily, it meant more people at home answering phones and the slow, heavy thud of official words like accusation and investigation. A reporter from the local paper called and asked if Marcus wanted to speak. He declined at first. Then Olivia, the CEO, requested a meeting. Marcus agreed because he wanted the truth acknowledged in private before people formed stories without his voice. They met in the lobby an hour before the board convened. The lobby was glass and echoing and smelled of lemon polish and fresh coffee. Javier, the night security guard, remembered Marcus from routine trash runs and stood nearby, pretending not to notice the sudden press presence. Claire, from the leasing office, watched with a face that tried to be impartial. Marcus entered and noticed the sheen of Olivia's coat and the quiet tension in her jaw. "Marcus," Olivia said, "I wanted to apologize for what was planned. I did not know the extent." "Apologies are fine," Marcus said, "but my daughter's life is not a punchline." Olivia looked small in that moment, and then stronger. "You are right. It should never have been that way." They spoke about Lily's silence about the therapy Marcus had paid for and the small green train. Olivia listened and then, unexpectedly, she offered to put the company's resources into a program for families in the building, a partnership with Dr. Aisha Patel's clinic and with local shelters. Marcus was wary. "That sounds like a company trying to buy forgiveness," he said. "It could be," Olivia admitted, "or it could be a start of doing something different. Will you let us prove which it will be?" There were no immediate answers, just a fragile agreement to see if actions would follow words. For Marcus, the question was whether his daughter's recovery would be tied to a corporation's PR cycle, or whether it would outlast headlines. The therapy process was simple in principle and deliberate in practice. Selective mutism treatment used techniques that eased pressure to speak while building alternate modes of interaction. Sessions involved play therapy, gradual exposure, parent coaching, and consistent routines. Therapists documented progress through calibrated observations and used reward-based stepping stones to encourage oral communication in safe settings. The focus remained on safety and empowerment, not on forcing a child beyond comfort. In practice, it meant many slow days of choosing not to ask questions and many small rewards for nonverbal interactions. Progress was measured in minutes of spoken word, not in headlines. As Olivia's company began to assemble a plan, forces inside the organization reacted. Daniel and Victor felt exposed and began to push back. They leaked internal emails that suggested the CEO had overstepped and accused management of making a spectacle of corporate generosity. The board split into factions. Media outlets smelled scandal, and journalists began asking about intent and about the company's history of philanthropic gestures. There were meetings in conference rooms where men in suits calculated reputational cost, and attorneys wrote statements like recipes. Sandra Lee navigated the legal requirements of privacy and consent and found the tightrope thin between meaningful apology and admission of liability. It became clear that the public relations problem was also a political one. Meanwhile, Marcus and Lily attended sessions with Dr. Aisha. The first sessions were slow. Lily would draw and nibble crackers and watch the therapist with large, guarded eyes. Dr. Aisha used tactile games with blocks and trained Marcus in ways to respond without pressing. On a rainy afternoon, a trick emerged as a miracle in miniature. Marcus remembered the sugar packet Lily loved to tear and fold. He brought a small glass jar of used sugar packets and a note that said, "Open if you need to talk." The jar was silly and small, but it became a ritual. At the third session, Dr. Aisha suggested they use the jar as a counting game. Lily picked the green train out of Marcus's bag and placed it beside the jar. She nudged a packet with her toe and then, astonishingly, whispered one word into the quiet room. The word was Mom. That whisper was a thin bridge. For Lily, it did not mean a full return to speech, but it was the first crack in a shell she had built to keep the world from touching a wound that had not healed. Marcus cried quietly in the waiting room at a small victory that felt like reclaiming a lost piece of himself. The therapists documented progress in notes that read like patient maps, and they suggested a plan for integration with the company's resources if the company could prove sustained commitment. There were moments of tension that were sharp like flares. One occurred when security mistakenly arrested Marcus at the building earlier because Daniel had circulated a doctored note implying Marcus had threatened staff. Officer Ramirez was summoned, and the process was humiliating and public. Marcus spent hours in a room answering questions while Lily waited at home unaware of the arrest, and Claire paced the leasing office floor with a face like thunder. The false accusation was short-lived. Surveillance footage and Javier's testimony cleared Marcus and revealed the tampered message. The arrest became a proof of how quickly a life could be disrupted by rumor, and how fragile the presumption of innocence is for someone in a lower rung of the building's labor chain. Another tension happened when an internal audit suggested Olivia's proposed foundation for family therapy would carry a conflict of interest, since it used company funds linked to vendors who had ties to the board. Harold Green, the legal counsel, argued that any program must go through a procurement review. Marcus feared that the program would be neutered into a paperwork exercise. Olivia fought quietly in back hallways, telling the board she wanted to do more than the minimal compliance that hid behind philanthropic statements. The battle was bureaucratic, but it mattered because its outcome would define whether children like Lily would get sustained support or a temporary headline. A third moment arrived when social media found a clip of Lily running. In a park that was shared with cruel captions, people online judged the family out of context. The clip was edited to look like Lily's silence was the result of parental failure. Trolls commented with a venom that made Marcus's chest ache like pressure. Olivia read the comments and felt the bitter taste of culpability. She publicly denounced the online abuse and called for civility and for resources to support families under stress. Her statement was strong, but it did not fix the root cause. The city council became involved and asked for a public meeting to discuss how corporations could be held accountable for internal cultures that encouraged cruel pranks. A fourth tension moment was a manipulative attempt by Daniel to salvage his reputation. He arranged a town hall inside a conference space and attempted to spin the story into one where the company had been transparent and generous all along. He claimed a narrative of learning and growth. The public smelled the spin and came with questions. A cluster of parents and local activists showed up carrying signs and stories of their own. The room shifted into a furnace of testimony. Marcus sat in the audience with Lily beside him, clutching her green train. He watched as the story he had lived was distilled down to few seconds of footage and then expanded by the people who had been harmed. The tension was electric, and it felt like either truth or erosion would win. The climactic town hall was the moment of reversal. Journalists packed the space, and the company arranged seating that tried to control optics. Olivia entered the stage and looked at the room not as a market to be conquered, but as a place where words might hold repair. She had rehearsed lines but had decided to speak from an unbuttoned place. She told the story of her brother and of the dinner, and then she did something no one expected. She read a statement and then stepped down from the microphone and walked toward the audience. She found Marcus and asked him to come to the front. Marcus stood as if the air had changed consistency. "Tell them about Lily," Olivia said simply. Marcus walked to the microphone with hands that trembled and told the room about late-night trains and crayons and the small ritual of sugar packets that had unlocked a whisper. He spoke of being a janitor and of the way his work felt invisible until that night. He spoke of the false arrest and of the way social media had twisted his life. He did not ask for pity. He asked for structures that put care first. Olivia then made a public commitment. She announced a foundation to fund childhood therapy in collaboration with local clinics and with a governance board that included parents and community representatives. She named Dr. Aisha Patel as a lead advisor and pledged initial funding and a transparent procurement process. It was not a panacea, but her words were specific and measurable and included timelines and accountability measures. Olivia then addressed the culture that had allowed the prank. She said the company would institute training on workplace dignity and revise policies to ensure employees at all levels are protected from humiliation. She spoke of systemic issues and promised to change procurement and bonuses tied to targets that incentivized risky behavior. The speech was long and full of specifics, and at moments she faltered and let the room feel the haltingness of actual repair. The crowd reacted in a way that felt like weather. Some applauded, some held back. Daniel Park looked pale and small. Victor's jaw clenched. Reporters scribbled and streamed and sent headlines that night that framed the event as a dramatic pivot. The press loved a clean arc and often simplified what had been messy and human. The company's board confirmed the commitments in writing and appointed a small oversight committee that included Claire and Mayor Thompson's representative and a representative from a child advocacy nonprofit. Olivia's public speech became the hinge that allowed real follow-through because it forced corporate governance to translate words into process. The legal and procurement description could be explained in plain terms. Contracts for service would be competitively bid, and oversight would be mandated by an external auditor to prevent conflicts of interest. The company would release quarterly reports on fund allocation and outcomes. These were small process descriptions, but each had teeth. A promise that the program would not be a one-time charitable splash, but a sustained commitment. After the town hall, things did not immediately become comfortable. There were more hearings and a probe into internal emails. Daniel resigned under pressure. Victor left with a severance package and a cloud of whispers. Sandra Lee stayed on, but with new directives. Javier received recognition for his honesty. Officer Ramirez wrote a brief that cleared Marcus and recommended sensitivity training for officers called to private building disputes. The local paper ran a long piece that followed Lily's therapy and the first words she had said in public at a park picnic, where she said, "Mom," and then "Mom" again, and then laughed. The clip of her laughing spread, and for a while the internet looked kinder. There were moments of private reconciliation that mattered more than the headlines. Olivia visited the small apartment where Marcus lived and brought a simple loaf of bread and a green train for Lily. She sat on a couch she had never chosen and listened and did not lead the conversation. She apologized again to Lily for the way people had used her life for laughs. She also listened when Marcus told her about nights of fear and about a father who had never said, "I am sorry." Olivia unbuttoned something in herself and told a story of a brother who had once come home with bruises he could not explain. Her confession did good. Not erase wrongs, but it created a fragility that allowed mutual repair. There were additional scenes of tension. A scheduled audit revealed procurement irregularities in a different department that had nothing to do with the prank, but which suggested an organizational opacity that could welcome ethical lapses. The Oversight Committee called for a thorough review. The City Council considered legislation that would regulate corporate-sponsored social programs in public housing complexes and asked for testimony. Dr. Aisha Patel prepared a report on therapy outcomes showing that earlier intervention significantly increased chances for speech recovery in cases of selective mutism. The report was technical yet accessible, and the committee used the findings to justify public funding. Therapy documentation was careful. Sessions were structured, and each therapy session note included observable behaviors, baseline step goals, and parent coaching feedback. Therapists used play and reward-based increments and documented a reduction in avoidance behaviors over weeks. Progress was quantified in minutes of spontaneous speech and the ability to tolerate participation in group play. Privacy was respected, and a consent protocol was implemented to ensure families chose participation. In the jargon of practice, these were small indices that meant the world to families like Marcus and Lily. Over time, the company's foundation released funds, but required matched community oversight and the inclusion of local providers to avoid vendor capture. The first grants went to community clinics and to pilot programs in 3 neighborhoods. The program paid for sessions and for transportation and for parent coaching and for materials that made therapy accessible. The foundation hired a small staff, including Claire as a community liaison and Dr. Aisha as clinical director. The Oversight Committee published its first report and included names and interviews with families helped by the program. One of the most poignant scenes happened in a park during a foundation picnic. Lily ran with her green train in hand and squealed when other children joined. Marcus sat with Olivia on a bench that smelled faintly of sun-warmed wood and spilled juice. They watched the children, and the sunlight caught on a sugar packet wrapper that someone had left on a bench like confetti. Marcus turned to Olivia and said, "Thank you." She nodded without pride. There were legal and procedural ripples. A new workplace training module was mandated covering dignity at work and social media ethics. Contracts for vendor services were renegotiated to prevent conflicts. The city introduced a policy for quick response to viral private recordings that exploited individuals for entertainment. These structural changes bore the marks of bureaucratic slow work, but they mattered because they reduced the likelihood of similar harms in the future. The epilogue came in 3 movements that show time passing and change consolidating. 1 month later, Marcus had begun part-time work at a community center supported by the foundation, where he helped with maintenance and with a child reading corner. He was on a modest stipend, paid partly by the foundation to compensate for his time at parent coaching sessions. Lily had attended 8 therapy sessions and had spoken in the waiting room twice, once to ask for a cookie and once to name a bird. They had a small routine where they shared a green apple after sessions and read a book with the train pictured on its cover. Olivia had set up an internal review and had requested that the board create a permanent fund line for family services. Media interest had cooled, but a human interest piece had run on a national morning show and had framed the events as a cautionary tale about power and humility. 3 months later, the foundation had allocated its first round of grants, and the community centers began to report incremental gains. Dr. Aisha's clinic opened a satellite therapy room in the building where Marcus worked and offered sliding-scale fees and group sessions for parents. Lily had started attending a small playgroup where she would sometimes whisper to another child and then run away laughing. Daniel Park had given a formal statement of regret and attended mandatory training and began volunteer work under supervision. A few employees quit, but many stayed and engaged in the new programs. The foundation published its first financial report, and the Oversight Committee held a public forum where parents could speak and ask questions. Marcus spoke at the forum and described how a jar of sugar packets had become a ritual of safety. People in the audience clapped and some wept. The company's stock movement was a footnote to what had become a social program that required honesty and a redistribution of attention to people who had been invisible. 6 months later, the program had evolved into a steady presence. The foundation had funded therapy for over 100 families in the first 2 quarters and had partnered with the city on a pilot public program in 3 neighborhoods. Lily had learned to speak in school more frequently and had built friendships. Marcus had been promoted to a facilities coordinator role that included training younger custodians and a modest raise that made rent less burden. The Oversight Committee had recommended changes in executive incentives to include social impact measures and not only revenue metrics. A small plaque in the lobby of the building recognized Javier's honesty and named the new family room funded by the foundation. Olivia had instituted an annual public review and had privately committed to meeting families and listening. She hosted a small gathering at the foundation's first anniversary where Marcus hung a drawing of a green train on the wall next to other child art. The company had not become perfect, but it had become less willing to accept cheap cruelty as culture. The story did not pretend to resolve every wound. The legal inquiries continued in faded forms, and some trust could not be bought by money alone. There were families who did not receive help and activists who argued the program did not go far enough. But the arc changed because people who had the power to make change decided to make it difficult to return to business as usual. Small process changes like mandatory consent for recordings and accountability for social media use actually produced fewer casual cruelties. A city ordinance was proposed, and activists pushed it forward. The foundation continued to publish transparent reports and invited community members to sit on its board to ensure voices making decisions included those who had been affected. The final image is simple. On a late summer afternoon, Lily and Marcus sat on a stoop and shared a sandwich that smelled of salt and warm bread. Lily had her green train at her feet, and a sugar packet fluttered like a small flag in the breeze. A neighbor called hello, and Lily answered back with a sentence that was plain and bright and ordinary. Marcus watched her speak and felt a lift in his chest like release. Olivia walked by, having come to drop off art supplies at the community center, and paused to watch for a moment. She did not speak. She nodded once, as if acknowledging that good work sometimes begins with a small, unexpected kindness and grows when people refuse to look away. If this story moved you, consider joining the community that follows and supports these families. If you have a moment of kindness to share, add it below beginning with the word kindness, so it can be found and read. If you want to learn more about how selective mutism therapy works or how corporate accountability measures can be implemented, we will link resources and expert interviews in the description. Sometimes the hardest courage is to stay and help rebuild. At the end, the truth was not a tidy victory, but a continuous practice. Marcus kept his job and found a measure of dignity. Lily kept speaking and kept her habit of tearing sugar packets into flags that she scattered over her drawings. Olivia kept the foundation going and added a new policy to prevent similar culture of cruelty. Names changed, but the pattern is what remained clear. When someone in power chooses to listen and to invest in structures that protect the vulnerable, something shifts. Sometimes a prank backfires and becomes a beginning. Sometimes a single, unexpected comment is the change edge that starts a process of repair. There was no miraculous end, only a series of small acts that accumulated into policy and into the quiet architecture of care. The city moved on, and yet in one building, a plaque and a green train kept a small story alive. Sometimes the bravest thing is to notice someone's small voice and to make the room safe for it to be heard. If this story touched you, consider subscribing for more narratives of repair and transformation, and share a kindness you have witnessed in the comments.